All right, everybody, welcome back to Top Story, where we analyze news headlines while playing some video games. Today's game is going to be Titanfall 2, arguably the best multiplayer FPS game ever created. In the Washington Post, let's see, the main one here is Trump draws rebukes for questioning election integrity. Then there's two subheadlines that say Trump allies Sidney Powell and Lynn Wood urge Georgians to boycott Senate runoffs. And the other one says Iowa Democrat wants U.S. House to review results of race she lost by 6 votes. I got to admit, if I'd lost a vote by 6 votes, that's a little tough. I could almost empathize with that one. Let's see. The Trump draws rebukes for questioning election integrity. Look, part of the rules of this show is that I can't click on the headline. I'd love to click on it to be able to see what exactly they're referring to. But it's kind of like he draws rebukes from who? Obviously half the country, all the like 70 plus million people that voted for Trump, most of them, it sounds like, according to polling data at least, believe that he was robbed of the election, that there was some sort of foul play involved with vote rigging or voter suppression or whatever it was. And I highly doubt they're rebuking him for questioning the election's integrity. They're probably on board. Whereas, of course, the other side, on whether it's Democrats or other establishment figures within the government or business community or elsewhere, are going to be questioning, are going to be giving him sharp rebukes for his questioning of the election integrity. And obviously, the legacy media is definitely going to be giving him sharp rebukes. So I guess it's simply a question of who is giving him, who is questioning him for questioning the election integrity. And the subheadline, by the way, is Trump allies Sidney Powell and Lynn Wood urge Georgians to boycott Senate runoffs. Now, I'm no expert, but as far as I understand, what my basic understanding is that the Georgia runoff election is incredibly important for the Senate. I mean, if Republicans want to maintain control of the Senate, so as to have a counterbalance to the Democratic presidency of Joe Biden, that's really, really, really important that Republicans vote in Georgia and make sure that you get Republicans in those Senate seats so that you don't have a Democratic majority in the Senate, the House, and the White House, because then you're going to be powerless to stop any of the things that you disagree with that they want to do. Obviously, it'd be good news for Democrats. So that seems like a silly strategy to boycott the Senate runoffs, because guess what? You'll boycott the runoff, but then, the Democratic candidate, if I were smarter, I would know who the names of these people. I'd probably recognize them if I heard them. Anyway, sorry. The Democratic candidate will simply get elected, and then you'll whine about it afterwards, but it won't change the fact on the ground, which is that there's now a Democrat in that seat, and they'll have a majority in the Senate, and you can cry foul all you want afterwards, but at the end of the day, you're going to have a Democratic majority in the Senate, and that's going to be bad news for you if you're a Republican. So that seems like a very, very, very stupid thing to do, to urge Georgians to boycott the Senate runoffs. Let's see, the next headline is Justice Department investigated potential bribery-for-pardon operation involving White House. The problem here is that the Washington Post has been so nakedly partisan against Donald Trump for the past 4 years that I don't know if this story is just yet another attempt to smear his presidency as corrupt and awful and evil, or is it a legitimate piece of journalism where there actually was this, bribery for pardon operation, which would really be the height of corruption at the highest levels of authority. Is that true? I mean, I don't know which one it is. And that's the problem with losing your credibility. When you're so nakedly partisan, you lose your credibility as an objective news outlet. So now when you actually do put out a story that could be legitimate, investigative journalism where you're holding power to account and shining a light on some instance of corruption, Now, when someone reads that headline or reads that story, they can't be 100% sure that they can trust you anymore. And that's really the big problem. So, if it's an honest piece of journalism, great. I'd love to see more pieces like that that expose corrupt practices. But if it's just another attempt to smear Donald Trump, then it's like, what the F, right? So I don't know which one it is, and that's the real sad state of American journalism. Just a couple more from the Washington Post. We have the coronavirus section here. The main headline with the picture of it looks like a football coach wearing I understand it's supposed to be a face mask, but this is what he's got going on is a little bit more intense. It looks like he's about to rob a bank. I mean, he's wearing like a black bandana covering on his face. He's got the hat as well, so all you can really see is his eyes. He looks like a bank robber, and that's really got to be. This is going to be the icon of the coronavirus age someday in the future, where everyone in the country looked like either a ninja or a bank robber, and that was just the way everybody looked for a little while. Anyway, the headline here is the thoughtless husks who plunged this NFL season into chaos deserve a public shaming. The subheadline is perhaps loud public shaming might at least prompt the unthinking to pause long enough for folks to run in the other direction. And it's by Sally Jenkins. I gotta admit, here's the thing. I don't follow football. I've never really been a big sports guy. I don't follow the NFL. And so I have no idea what Sally Jenkins is talking about. Obviously, she's very upset with somebody within the NFL organization calling them thoughtless husks. I mean, that's pretty intense. I mean, I wouldn't like to be called a thoughtless husk. Next headline is Pelosi, Schumer say bipartisan $908 billion relief proposal should be starting point for new talks. $908 billion. Wow, that's a lot of... Well, anyway, the subheadline is the Democratic leaders had previously demanded a much bigger stimulus bill, but the flagging economy is creating more pressure for action before the end of the year. One of the things we've become so accustomed to seeing numbers like this, 908 billion, 2.3 trillion, or whatever else. I mean, these massive numbers, that we become desensitized to them in a way, right? It's kind of like the video game you're watching right now. All the violence that you're seeing is you become desensitized to it after a while, and we become desensitized to these ridiculous numbers, 908 billion, as if it's just a bag of peanuts. And this is much smaller than what they had originally wanted, and I believe the previous stimulus bill was somewhere in the trillions, maybe 1.8 or 2.8 or whatever it was, $1 trillion, and that will only be one of probably several to come. My only question is where does this money come from? Because believe me, no one... Well, there are people who understand better than me, but I understand very well how, a central bank works and how it creates money and how you can borrow it and print it and do that I understand how that process works. But at the end of the day, you can create more dollars, but you can't create more wealth. So every time you print money, you just dilute the money supply and you therefore lower the buying power, the purchasing power of the money that's in circulation right now. And that's why people will call it a silent tax, because let's say you have $1,000 in your bank account. Well, inflation, which is the decreased buying power of your currency, if that goes up / your buying power goes down, then that $1,000, let's say, is only worth, 80% or half of what it was yesterday. So it's in effect, it's as if you just paid $200 or $500 to the government in the form of a tax, but it doesn't look that way because you didn't write any checks. But if in effect, it's the same thing. And so how do you get this money? Because as far as I know, I think the annual tax revenue for the government is only somewhere around $1 trillion. And obviously they spend a lot more than that every single year. They usually spend, I don't know, it's like $2 or $3 trillion every year. And then of course, if you have stimulus bills of this size on a regular basis, you're going to be spending $5-6 trillion a year, just from the federal government alone. And I don't fully understand where you get this money from, how this works exactly. I understand you can print it, but in effect, all you're doing is lowering the purchasing power of everybody's money that they already have, that you just make everything more expensive. So it's like if you want to buy a meal at McDonald's and it costs $5 right now, well, after they do all these stimulus proposals or stimulus plans and they print all this new money, well, then suddenly you're going to go to McDonald's and the same meal will now cost, $20. And you'll be essentially in the same boat that you're in right now. And I don't, so I don't fully understand what is going on there. Now, presumably, banks make a lot of money with these kinds of stimulus and bailout packages and whatnot, where you print all this new money, because the primary dealer banks, which are the very first ones to get their hands on this money, they get it before the inflation has set in, and they're able to make investments and make money based on it that are real before the purchasing power of the money goes down. So the further down the chain you are, which is you and I, as we finally get this money in checks and our paychecks and whatever else, by that point the inflation has already started to set in and the purchasing power has already started to decrease. But if you're one of the primary dealer banks that's involved in the open market operations of the Federal Reserve, then you get this money first, and so the purchasing power of money hasn't declined yet, and therefore that's how you can become enormously wealthy and have really fancy buildings. So I would love to see a conversation on that, about that on the Washington Post, but you will never see that there. And somehow questioning this with respect to how our monetary policy works has become synonymous with like a conspiracy theory, and it's really not. It's simply basic economics, and that's an interesting thing. The last one I'll look at from Washington Post is Britain's quick vaccine approval prompts grumbling in countries taking slower approach. Subheadline is Britain is first to grant emergency approval for Pfizer's vaccine. All right, I mean, I don't know exactly what the point of that headline is. I mean, if I were writing that headline, I would just say that Britain has approved a vaccine, and it's like one of the first to do so. I don't know why you have to make it as within the context of other countries sort of expressing sort of a sour grapes opinion, like, oh, yeah, you did it first, how dare you? Or I don't know why you have to put it in that kind of context. But it sort of reminds me of back in the day when Trump was doing those daily pressers every single day about the coronavirus, and the news coverage would always frame it in terms of how the U.S. was behind all these other countries, or that it had a worse, infection rate, or it had a higher death toll, or whatever else, and it would treat it as this contest between the U.S. and other countries. And the point of that being is that, if this country or that country has this small number of deaths or this small number of infections, and the U.S. has this really high number of deaths and infections, then clearly the government is doing something wrong and is performing poorly. And then when Trump would then make comparison to other countries, and he would say, "Oh no, we're leading the world in this, or we're leading the world in that," maybe perhaps with vaccine development or whatever else. Then they would suddenly be like, why do you gotta treat this like it's some kind of competition, man? They would always do that, and it was extremely frustrating. And it seems like they're doing, I know this is a little bit different, but it's the same kind of thing. They always create this narrative of like countries in competition with each other when it comes to creating vaccines or what their infection rate is or whatever else. But then as soon as it becomes inconvenient, they're like, whoa, it's not a competition, and all right, it's very frustrating. Anyway, we're going to move on to the next paper here, which of course is going to be the New York Times. The first headline is CDC shortens quarantine guidance and warns against holiday travel. Okay, but the subheadlines are people who may have had coronavirus exposure but are asymptomatic can quarantine for 7 days instead of 14 if they test negative, the CDC said. And there's another one that says agency officials recommended that those who end up traveling get tested within days before and after their trips. For some reason, when I read this, now I could be wrong, but when I read this, I got the impression, or at least I got a feeling, that is anybody even listening to this anymore? Right? Like if they make it into a mandate and they have, cops with guns enforcing these rules, then people have no choice but to comply. But with a lot of this stuff, it's fairly unenforceable, and they're calling them recommendations, I guess, or guidance. That's always what it's called, a guidance. But who are people really doing this? I mean, are people waking up, like all 300 million people in the United States? Are they waking up every morning, reading the New York Times, going, the CDC said I only have to quarantine for 7 days if I test negative, and okay, that's what I'm gonna do. I just get the impression that at this point, nobody's really paying attention to this stuff anymore. And that's either for better or for worse, and it really depends on your point of view. If you're of the point of view that this virus, essentially what happened with this virus, and this was a global phenomenon, that governments around the world, and in fact even peoples around the world, we overreacted. We did. This is, yes, it is a deadly virus. Yes, it is dangerous. And yes, there probably do need to be various protective measures, especially to protect the particularly vulnerable, whether that be the elderly or people with pre-existing conditions. But does it warrant quite the level of lockdowns and paranoia that it has fostered instead? And I think a lot of people are starting to think, no, it doesn't. The numbers, the statistics, they just don't bear out this level of alarm, in terms of how deadly the virus is or whatever else. And they don't justify shutting down world economies and, not world economies, but shutting down national economies across the world. And it doesn't really justify all the negative consequences of that, which are most likely going to be a second Great Depression around the world, and small business owners, millions of them around the world losing their businesses, a further transference of wealth from the many to the few as business consolidates in large online companies like Amazon.com, and, all the various consequences of this, be they financial or mental. I mean, obviously a lot of problems with mental health. Suicide rates are up around the world. There was an alarming statistic the other day out of Japan where they had more deaths from suicide, in a recent month than they have had from the coronavirus. And that is bad. And I think there will be long-term effects. There will be long-term effects on kids who have been forced to not go to school and been learning from home on Zoom and other things, which I think people are waking up to the fact that that's just not very effective, especially for little kids. They're not really going to learn anything. Plus, as people have pointed out as well, the main benefit to school, well, not the main benefit, but one of the primary benefits to school is not so much the book learning that takes place there, while that is, of course, important. It's also the socialization aspect of it. It's learning how to interact with other, kids your age, because it's very different interacting with large groups of other kids as opposed to just interacting with your parents. Very, very different, and you're developing key life skills when you do that at a young age. And that, in some ways, is one of the most important aspects of going to school. So, anyway, the stuff with the CDC and all the guidelines that they're putting out, sometimes I just wonder if people are really following it or not. And of course, the other guideline is that if people are not following this stuff, if there's sort of, quarantine fatigue in which people are like, screw this, I'm just going to do my own thing. This is a bunch of nonsense. Well, if it turns out that the virus actually is as dangerous as some people fear it to be, well, then suddenly you have a sort of a non-compliant populace who are not going to take the measures necessary to, stem the spread, and it's really it's tough, and it all boils down to the crisis of trust in the country, where nobody really trusts anything anymore. Nobody trusts the mainstream media. Nobody trusts the government. Nobody trusts large corporations. Nobody trusts anybody really, and or at least nobody from what you might call an opposing team, along the partisan divide. So it's It's really tough. It makes it very tough to come together and do anything. Next headline is Iran moves to increase uranium enrichment and bar nuclear inspectors. The subheadline is the move came in response to the killing of Iran's top nuclear scientist and sets up an early test for President-elect Joe Biden. I gotta admit, what a headline like this, I understand it's on the front page of the New York Times. It is. But it is definitely several stories below the first one, as well as a couple gigantic sized ads. So it does feel like it's fairly low on the page. But I swear to God, like a headline like this, Iran moves to increase uranium enrichment and bar nuclear inspectors. If you were watching like an end of the world movie, like a Terminator 2 where humanity destroys itself with a nuclear war or something, and then they were showing like the retrospective of how like all the warning signs were there and nobody really paid attention. You would see a montage of headlines that look like this, right? You'd see these things saying Iran moves to increase uranium enrichment, Iran creates first nuclear bomb, Iran threatens Israel. You'd see this montage of headlines that look exactly like that. And I think we're in the middle of that little montage with nobody caring too much about that issue. I understand some people definitely care about it a lot, although most of the griping seems to be about how the Democratic Party is openly sort of not siding with Iran, but saying that Israel did do this thing, and people are looking at that in sort of a partisan light and saying, oh, you shouldn't take Iran's side, you should always take Israel's side. And honestly, I have no idea what's the proper thing to do in that case. I mean, if Israel did kill their top nuclear inspector, I can certainly see a rationale for that, because the U.S. takes out people they don't like all the time. I mean, I forget the name of the Iranian. I think he was the head of the Al-Quds force, which is like an Iranian intelligence kind of paramilitary wing of their Revolutionary Guard. When we took out when the U.S. took out that guy, obviously we're like, hey, this guy was a threat. He was a bad guy, and and he needed to go. So it's like, okay, that's a good thing. But then you can obviously see how Israel might look at the top nuclear scientist for Iran, and they view Iran's nuclear program as an existential threat to the existence of their entire country. And so you can see why they might be motivated to take the guy out. Now, that doesn't mean I condone it. It's probably not a good idea to assassinate people. That's not it's not something I would recommend to anybody. But at the same time, the U.S. does things like that all the time. Israel is probably going to do stuff like that from their perspective. It probably makes sense. But then at the same time, you can look at it from Iran's perspective and, look at the security threats that they face, whether it be from the U.S. or Israel or whatever. And Israel, of course, has nuclear weapons. So does the United States, as well as, of course, a Navy that can blockade them at will and completely destroy them. And both of these countries are hostile towards them, so they have to make moves that that they see as in their interest to protect their national sovereignty and integrity, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, at the end of the day, this is just statecraft on all sides, and whether or not it's good or not, whether or not it's pretty or not, obviously it's probably not, but it is what it is, and this is how international relations works. Anyway, so that's that. We're gonna now move on to the next one here. We've got Vox. Which is always one of my favorites. You can always count on Vox for some really funny headlines here, and they're not trying to be funny. I want to make that clear. They're dead serious, but I tend to find them funny. How Trump's blizzard of misleading fundraising emails explains his refusal to concede. Subheadline is, it's bad for the country, but it's raking in the money for Trump. These questions sort of beg us to know the impossible, which is what is truly in Trump's heart. Is this simply a ploy to make money after he's out of the Oval Office, which very, very easily could be the case? He's setting himself up either for a 2024 run, or he's setting himself up for whatever business ventures he's going to have in the future, because even after he's out of office, the millions upon millions of people who supported him will still be his supporters and will listen to what he says, and he will probably continue to drive the news cycle for quite a long time. And so it very likely is possible that a lot of his efforts right now are a cynical effort to set himself up for, his post White House life, or he genuinely believes that there was foul play in this election and he thinks he was robbed and is doing everything he can while he has time to try to reverse the decision, or not let himself get robbed. And it really depends on your perspective on which one of those you're going to go with. And I can see strong arguments for both. I really can. And so it just depends. Something tells me that Vox's article is probably not going to be, looking at both sides of that issue. It's simply going to be saying that Trump is a jerk. But nevertheless, whether places like Vox or the New York Times like to admit it or not, there are two sides to this coin. There are two arguments to be made. There are, in fact, if not evidence, but like very alarming coincidences and statistical anomalies that are starting to present themselves with respect to the vote count in certain battleground states, whether that be Georgia or Pennsylvania or elsewhere, that do demand some level of investigation. So the oft-repeated claim that this is simply a baseless, claim of election rigging or fraud is not quite so baseless anymore. There actually is stuff that needs to be looked at. Now, upon further inspection, it might prove to be nothing super spectacular, and that'd be great. But no matter how many times, mainstream media sources claim that this is something that has no merit whatsoever, that doesn't necessarily make it true, and you do actually have to investigate this stuff. So let's see. The next one is 3 Hong Kong pro-democracy icons were sentenced to prison in huge blow to protest movement. Joshua Wong, Angus Chow, and Ivan Lam pleaded guilty to participating in an unsanctioned protest in 2019. I have to admit, this is unrelated, but is it pleaded guilty or pled guilty? That would be worth looking up. You know what we're going to do? We're going to look that up. We're going to go to Google, and we are going to look up pled versus pleaded. That's a top search. Once you type in pled versus pleaded is the same one. Merriam-Webster's College Dictionary says the simple past tense and the past participle form of pleaded or pled in that order. That means you can use both. So both are good. Past participle. I don't know what participle means. But all right, here we go. Sorry, got a little sidetracked, but I have nothing to say about the pro-democracy icons who are sentenced to prison in huge blow to protest movement in Hong Kong. I don't know enough about the situation in Hong Kong. Just part of me almost wants to say, well, what did you think was going to happen? Right? I mean, what was it when Hong Kong reverted back to Chinese control in either the late 90s, I think it was. And of course, initially, because Hong Kong is such a financial powerhouse and, it's a delicate thing, you don't want to just run in there with like the Red Army and the People's Liberation Army and just start taking over. No, I mean, you're going to be more gradual about it. But at the end of the day, this is now a city that is under China's sovereignty. And so, did you really think that they were going to allow this kind of pro-democracy Western, city that has a lot of wealth and influence to exist under their banner and cause maybe other people in China who are still, because remember, there are still hundreds and hundreds of millions of people in China who are desperately poor and very susceptible to criticisms of the government, because when you're desperately poor and someone comes along and says, hey, it doesn't have to be this way, that's going to make you inclined towards insurrection, right? So China can't really tolerate that kind of stuff. So I got to admit, it's like, what did you think was going to happen? Did you think China was just going to let you guys continue to be this separate democratic utopia, with total freedom of speech and everything, and they were just going to look the other way? Of course they weren't. They're going to increase their laws gradually, but of course they're going to do that. And it's sad that it's happening. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't support it or anything, but it does seem like this should have been a fairly obvious thing that was going to happen for the past, couple of decades. The next one is General Milley. What kind of name is that? I think it might even be Miley, like Miley Cyrus. It's got two L's, so I think it's Millie. But General Miley or Milley. Milli Vanilli. That's what I was thinking. That's where I thought it sounded from. Yeah, that's what it came from. So maybe Milli Vanilli became a general. Who knows? But anyway, General Milley, Joint Chiefs Chair, just gave a brutally honest assessment of the Afghanistan war. Well, good for General Milley. We believe that now, after 20 years, 2 decades of consistent effort there, we've achieved a modicum of success, he said on Wednesday. I'm sorry. That statement could be taken out of any dystopian movie, or especially any kind of political satire movie like Idiocracy, for example, where we believe after 20 years of consistent effort, we've achieved a modicum of success. That is such a sad statement to make. I mean, that is really such a sad statement to make. I believe in Tucker Carlson's book, he says, for perspective on the Afghanistan war, which we've now been in for roughly 20 years now, all the exploits of Napoleon Bonaparte took place in less time than we've been in Afghanistan trying to turn it into a stable democracy. And Bonaparte's like, conquering most of Europe and then getting exiled and coming back and like waging another war and then getting exiled again and all this stuff. Like all of that took less time than we've been in Afghanistan. And as far as I think anybody can really tell, even according to General Milley, there's only been a modicum of success, and modicum means a very small amount, and that's really, really sad. I shouldn't be laughing at that because obviously a lot of people have died, U.S. soldiers and Afghans alike and Afghanis alike, and so it's really sad. It's really sad, and it's one of those things that's so sad that I don't want to belittle it by laughing, but I gotta say it's so sad that all you can really do is laugh at it, because it's just such a ridiculous thing. The last one is the government's failure to provide economic relief is killing people. Well, now that is right to the point. I got to admit, the author of this one, Anna North, did not mince words with this one. The government's failure to provide economic relief is killing people. No might be killing people, no probably is killing people. No. It is killing people. Good job to Anna North for not mincing words there. Gotta like it. Gotta respect it. The subheadline is the lack of funding from Congress is making the pandemic worse. Wow. I would be very tempted to click on this headline, because I'm hoping that inside this article there's going to be statistical data backing this up, because that would make it a very strong piece. If you're like, look, the results, the numbers are in, and this is killing people, because she's saying this as 100% fact. She is making this statement as if she is saying the Earth is round, right? Like there's no second guessing this. No, it is killing people, and Congress, the lack of funding from Congress is making the pandemic worse. I would sure hope she has numbers in that. I would assume she will. But once again, because of the rules of this show, I can't click on it. So I'm hoping that she does, and if she does, that's a great piece, and good for her. So on to the next one, which is the Huffington Post. As I always like to say, Huffington Post has really got a very cheap layout at this point. It's very reminiscent of the Daily Mail in the UK, where the layout of the page is like instead of having different tabs that you'll open on the page, it's just this one long continuous scrolling that you can just scroll down the page, apparently for infinity. You can just keep going and going and going forever. And and then there's all these like cheap ads along like the right hand side, and this is the Daily Mail. You don't see that so much with the Huffington Post, but it's a similar layout. And there are all these like cheap like clickbait type ads, usually like at least a few of them are going to involve some paparazzi photo of a female celebrity in a bikini somewhere, like a candid shot. And the HuffPost has really kind of adopted that model for the layout of its website, which is sad because it's a very kind of tabloidy type of thing. But I guess that's to be expected because their headlines have become increasingly sensational and not sensational is a good way, as in sensationalist and very tabloidy and blah blah blah. So let's see, their top story here is assault on their top story here is assault on democracy. Wisconsin governor rips Trump suit. I'm sorry. And the picture, I gotta admit the picture's funny. You know, you can see it on your screen right here. The picture of, I'm assuming, there's no caption, so I'm assuming that is the Wisconsin governor. And it's just this kind of like, just shot of like his face looking in the distance, and he's kind of, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just me. I find his face funny. He's a comical looking human being. But that could just be me. You know, I understand that what they're saying is that the assault on democracy is what obviously this Wisconsin governor said, and it's saying that he rips Trump's lawsuit. But in their efforts towards brevity, I understand they're talking about a lawsuit when they say the word suit, but rips Trump's suit. That, you know, for some reason I picture the guy ripping Trump's actual suit that he's wearing. You know, like with his hands or something, and It's a weird title. I got to admit, it's a very, like most HuffPost headlines. It's a very strange headline. They definitely are aiming for sort of clickbait style headlines. Down past this, latest news is very dark couple of weeks. Morgues and hospitals overflow. I'd love to click on that one. I mean, my understanding is that. Even though at the height of the pandemic, the biggest fear was that, you know, you would overrun the hospitals, but that never really happened. And those first 2 weeks of lockdown were supposed to flatten the curve. And then, of course, 2 weeks turned into, 100 years. And, with that kind of boiled frog effect where just, they just kept moving the goalposts, from, first it's 2 weeks, then it's a couple months, and then it's a few more months, and then it's another year, and maybe it's going to be another 2 years, and maybe you just will wear the mask indefinitely and 6 feet apart and all that stuff. And I have to admit, I would have to, once again, this goes down to the crisis of trust. Do I really trust Huffington Post when it tells me that the morgues and hospitals are overflowing? And I gotta say, unfortunately, I don't. I do not trust them when they say that. I don't know if they're simply taking anecdotal evidence from a few places, or if they are accurately reporting things. It says very dark couple of months in a quote, but I don't know who that's a quote from. I hope that the piece, when you click on it, lets you know, but doesn't tell me here. So somebody out there in this world thinks that this has been a very dark couple of weeks. Many people might say this has been a very dark, 8 or 9 months, but somebody who's hopefully quoted in this piece thinks it was a very dark couple of weeks because morgues and hospitals overflow. Anyway, so the coronavirus, first one is coronavirus. It says Mitch McConnell's incredible shrinking unemployment benefits. The second one says Joe Biden looks to the road ahead, says he's ready to fight like hell for America. Here's my prediction. And this is actually based on some stuff that I'm not going to get into now. It actually has more to do with a book that I read about geopolitics called The Calm Before the Storm by George. Why is his name? George Friedman. This has something to do with his predictions, and I'm not going to get into that specifically, but my prediction for Joe Biden, and it's not necessarily his fault, but he is going to have one of the most disastrous presidencies in U.S. history. That's my prediction. If that turns out to be the case over the next few years, I will refer you back to this video. You heard it here first. And I don't just mean that because in some partisan way, like, oh, I don't like Joe Biden and, and I'm upset that he got elected. I don't like Joe Biden. But at the same time, I just mean that he's going to have one of the most fraught with difficulties presidencies that are going to display a level of ineptitude to handle any of the problems that he's faced with that it's going to make the Trump presidency look like an absolute walk in the park, and it's going to be one of the most sad, pathetic presidencies in the history of the country. That's my prediction. But when you see the picture of him here with like his 2 thumbs up and his ninja mask, and he's ready to fight like hell for America and stuff, I don't know. A headline like this doesn't really say anything, does it? And first of all, it's under the coronavirus headline, so it doesn't say anything about coronavirus. He says, looks to the road ahead, says he's ready to fight like hell for America. That could mean anything. I mean, that could be with respect to the coronavirus, or it could be with respect to jobs. It could be with respect to the economy. It could be with respect to any number of issues. Might as well just say Joe Biden says that he's a really great guy. Like, that's essentially what this headline says. He's ready to fight like hell for America. Well, okay. Great. I hope he does. But he will fail. I promise you that. And it won't really even be his fault. It has more to do with forces that are larger than him or anyone else. But he will most definitely fail in his fight for America if he tries to fight at all, because it's probably just some empty political slogan, and who gives a shit. All right. Well, that does it for the latest episode of Top Stories. I didn't get to make fun of as many stories as I usually like to. For some strange reason, many of the headlines were actually fairly straight news, or they were about subjects that I knew nothing about, which is certainly something that happens from time to time, if not frequently, all the time. So, that's it for today's episode, and tune in next time, and that's it. Have a nice day, everybody. Bye-bye.